All right, I should be able to wrap up this series in this video. Now, it's useful to keep in mind, just to orient ourselves to where we are now after the first two videos and such, that creativity is not the goal. Creativity in and of itself is not something we need to strive for or not. What we want to do, in essence, the goal is the goal. The way we want things to be is what we want. And so we don't have to be creative. If we can get there without being creative, then that's fine. Then what I'm going to talk about primarily in this video is to see a bit more of how your brain works by default, so that you can have little signals and realizations of when you're going to particularly want to be creative in order to get the result that you want. And then a little bit more on how to do that. In essence, the opposite of creativity would be shutting down and refusing to address a question. The way this can look in business is you can just get frustrated or angry or depressed or just feel helpless. In a relationship, shutting down can involve all those things. And it's really the thing that made the most difference for me before I met my wife and figuring out what I really wanted to look for in a woman. And I was correct in this, so that's why I'm sharing it. There needed to be a chemistry where we were both attracted to each other. But then there's really one other thing that was necessary. And that was that the woman that I would end up marrying needed to, or even that I would want to date or whatever, needed to, I called it at the time kind of like seek understanding, but basically what that meant was they needed to not shut down, ideally regarding anything, and at least regarding things that we would need to address in life that we would run into. Unfortunately, it's very common for people to have certain areas of their lives, certain beliefs or things where they just don't want to ask questions about them or address them. Instead, they'll shut down, get angry, get offended, run out of the house, whatever it might be. It's perfectly fine to take a break, right? And to calm down, even sleep on something. People say don't go to bed angry, but it's one way or the other. I just don't want someone that's going to shut down in an ultimate fashion or in a way that's going to last for days and days. One amazing thing about my closest friend and business partner, Mike Long, and the reason it's been a no-brainer for me to stick with him and for him to be such a close person in my life for so long, is because he just doesn't shut down on things, and which means at least he'll let me ask questions. Anyone can get upset from time to time, but then it would always be within a short period of time. Like whatever we wanted to investigate or something, he would open his mind up and deal with it. And these days, he basically just defaults to that, like pretty much every time. So it's just wonderful to have that in a friend. And it's a little bit different than creativity in one sense and when I talk about shutting down in terms of relationships, we're talking about now someone who at least lets you be creative and try to improve on things and so forth. And I don't mean, of course, just being critical of them constantly and trying to improve that, but just asking good questions in general. So in relationships, then shutting down, it isn't even that you need someone that themselves is particularly creative or asks great questions. I don't really care about intelligence or whatever in a relationship. My wife is great. That's not some backhand thing about my wife. She's plenty smart, but it wasn't important to me. And I think for good reason. What matters is whether they're going to shut down if you're trying to be creative or whether they're not going to shut down. And then in like politics, you could see people shut down all the time. Instead of addressing an argument by the facts or logic, they'll attack the actual person and they'll be offended, or they'll try to get the person to be quiet in some way, whether they'll morally go directly in the Latin, right? It's called like an ad hominem attack, where they're going straight to the person and attacking them. With religion, people might do that, but they also might shut down in a way where they just retreat into themselves and they say, you can believe what you want and I can believe what I want. The trouble with that is that it's better for everyone to believe what's actually true. And about something as important as God, then presumably you want to help other people to see what's true. I don't mean you need to nag them or make their life difficult at all or whack them over the head with a big solid, Bible or whatever book. But if you shut down yourself and retreat in of yourself and use one of the things I tried to fight against is people behaving as if the Bible is the very bottom and core of what's called their epistemology, which is their method of knowing what's true. Even if, first of all, the only way to understand what's in the Bible would be to interpret it with your own mind. So you'd be claiming infallibility of your own mind's interpretation. And then on top of that, it just isn't there. It's reasonable to ask, why is the Bible true? And so if someone can have an answer to that, then great. Then they can do a better job. If the Bible is true, or whatever that might mean, then, or if certain things in it are true, such as that Jesus was God and such, then if someone's a Christian, then by having a deep basis for the reason for understanding all of that, and not just reasonable sounding reasons, but actually reasons that are utterly solid, where your understanding of what's true is based on something that's perfectly clear and certain, then you can do a better job explaining to other people why that's correct as well. If someone believes that Paul, who wrote part of the way what became later the Bible, that if someone believes that Paul is absolutely infallible, then it's pretty hard to talk to a Muslim who thinks that Muhammad was infallible, because the Muslim can't see the difference between what's the difference between Muhammad and Paul. Jesus didn't mention either one of them, right? And they both just wrote stuff, and then afterwards people decided that it was infallible. So this idea of shutting down ends up being, I don't know if when I say it's the opposite of creativity, that might be not the perfect way to put it. I might not be using the word opposite in the way that I normally do with great precision, but certainly in practice, the opposite effect to forming creative questions would be to just shut. And it's probably correct. I'm not thinking it perfectly through right now, but it's probably correct that they really are basically opposites, is that you're either asking creative questions or you're shutting down. Well, actually, let me just make sure we think this through here for a second. So we constructed the idea of creativity with the idea that your brain and your body are going to run on default, by default. That however they would normally act based however your brain, or what you call you, but it's not you, but however your body and brain would normally act based upon all of its past experiences and whatever you've done in the past to be creative and so forth. But however your brain's configured right now, that's how it would act right now regarding a particular situation or problem. And if you don't consciously interfere, then however it would act into the future on that problem. That's the default. And then you can use creativity in order to try to improve on that. And the question is when to do that. And if it's the case that you don't fully understand the issue at hand that you're dealing with, that we're talking about being creative about or having the default, if you don't fully understand it, whatever that might mean to understand something, and then also if the optimal result is not going to be achieved, then you're either creative or you shut down regarding that particular thing, right? At that point, I'm constructing the idea of shutting down as I've constructed the idea of what it means to be creative in that case where you're asking a question in order to try to improve on the default. And then if you were to notice that you don't perfectly understand and that you're not going to get the perfect result and you're still not going to ask a question, then that is shutting down, as I'm talking about it. And it looks like that is an exact opposite. So I'm saying you're not asking the question. And I said that asking the question is creativity, and then not asking the question, despite the fact that everything's not perfect, would be shutting down and just letting the default. You're shutting down your conscious creativity and just letting the default happen, even though you should be able to tell that it's not perfect. And when you do that, not only do you get something that's not perfect, but you're implying that you're relatively helpless whenever you accept an imperfect result without creativity. Now, you could instead decide that something else is more important, and that would be a difference, but that isn't quite the same as shutting down. You might realize there's a question there to improve on something, and in essence ask it, but actually I want to spend my creative focus on something that's more important. In that case, you're shutting down perhaps temporarily on a particular issue, but your reasoning is solid, which is you're going to something that at least seems more important. And then you might want to ask the question whether it's more important or it might be fairly urgent where you just need to attend to it. All right. Regardless of how critically important it was to work through that or not, it probably was very important. It's great to understand things that are important, like creativity. Mhm. That also served as an example of how to think through things with the law of implication methodology, where you're using opposites and mismatching and so forth, seeing what doesn't match. And you're also carefully constructing and reminding yourself of how you construct, of the definition that you can construct it and so forth. All right, I'm on a slide that I haven't talked about yet. If I ever do that and it's ever distracting you, then it's a good idea to pause the video and just write down what's on or at least read and maybe write down what's on the screen. And if I'm talking about something that's not on the screen at all, you might want to look away actually from the screen. I try to put a bunch of stuff on slides, but sometimes, of course, I'll talk about something that isn't on the slide. All right, so I've listed 3 things where your brain is going to predictably go wrong. Now, I also remember I talked about how your brain does cause and effect, and it does it in a way that isn't like it's wrongly designed, your brain, but it does it, in essence, the best it can for not having so unconsciously interfere, where it tries to see what's in the immediate environment that's new and unique, that is closest in time and space to the effect that it's trying to figure the cause for, getting sick or a ball moving or you feeling angry, then it does cause an effect in that way. Great. And so be aware of that. Now let's talk about linear extrapolation. This is a pretty big deal to understand. Particularly, you can see it really well in communication. You can also see it in sales, where people pretty often they'll say that oh, hey, this advertising campaign or this headline or this thing worked somewhere else, and so it'll work for us, basically. And that it is surprisingly common for marketing that worked in one place to not work somewhere else. Conditions can be different. The context can be different. The knowledge of people in the marketplace or what they're already have seen before can be different. That's probably an example of linear extrapolation. I can force it to fit that or not. Regardless, it's a useful thing to be aware of. But to me, it feels like it fits in the linear extrapolation. Another thing of what I mean, it's just like something just going in a straight line, like a trend is going to continue in a straight line. And often life does not work that way. Plenty of times it does, which is why your subconscious does this by default. It's probably the most common thing that'll happen. If someone behaves a certain way consistently, like if they're late fairly often, it's totally reasonable to plan on being late the next time. I've talked about this before with reasoning by analogy. You want to be careful, though, the extent to which you start to create a spiral with that person where you're making it more likely they're going to be late by your own actions. So you might not want to do that, but you can plan on it. But I try to plan on it in ways that don't reinforce their lateness. Mostly when someone's late, I try to plan on it so it doesn't really upset me. And if it's going to really cause me a problem if they're late, I will try to deal with that up front and explain to the person up front that like what and why it's going to be what the effect on myself is going to be if they're late. Usually doesn't happen with me, but if that kind of thing is going to come up, I'll try to tell them in advance. And that's a bit of a creative response to the idea of people being late. Instead of letting it blindside me, I have a book, I have something I can do. And again, particularly if someone has been late, but also just it's even linear just to say people in general are often late for things, right? And it's reasonably predictable that it can happen. And so being prepared for it tends to be good, and doing your best to head it off if it's going to be particularly inconvenient is useful too. I normally don't try to punish people for being late because generally they're just going to hold that against me. So mostly it's one of those things in life that the only way you can try to deal with it in advance. And also by not reinforcing it, I try not to make it more likely to be late by me expecting them to be late or anything like that, or being late myself, because of course that tends to be disrespectful of someone's time, and respect is one of the, of course, most key things in relationships, including business relationships, of course. All right. So projection and communication, our brain thinks in a linear fashion as well, in the sense that by default, it's going to constantly think that what a phrase or what a statement or any piece of communication, what it means to you, when you're speaking, what a phrase means to you or to its brain, your brain's going to linearly extrapolate that to figure that it means the same thing to the other person. And of course, that also works a lot, right? You can't constantly be starting from scratch in communication, right? And trying to pantomime or do whatever, right? And trying to communicate things that won't even work either. So that is reasonable, except you want to be aware that your brain's going to constantly be defaulting to presuming that other people will get the same thing from your communication that you intend. But of course, as I talk about often with a lot of implication, all that matters is what is in their mind. And so you want to be asking questions. Essentially, when you're communicating with someone, that's a great time to be creative, to turn on your creative question asking. And in particularly, you want to be asking yourself, not them directly, and not even yourself either directly. You just want to be asking, as I talked about in the first video, you want to ask questions sort of not to any particular source, but you want to be opening up the space to the idea that what they're interpreting your communication as might not be the same as what your brain's interpreting your communication as. And to be really looking for signs that there's misinterpretation. And one of the things I do, this might take some planning at first. It's hard for you to know how easy or hard this is for other people to do. But what you can do is I'll just state it first. I'll try to explain. You can take a conclusion that you have and you use that conclusion as a premise. As a premise okay, I'll explain that first. So if you think that the other person understood what you hope that they understood, then that's a conclusion. The conclusion is the other person got the meaning that I have in my mind, right? That they was successfully communicated. So that's the conclusion. Now what you want to do is take that conclusion and treat it as a premise, and you want to build off of that premise, and you want to think of some response that they would give, some action that they would take or something, if it was true that they really got your communication. So if you are a woman and you say to your man, we never go out anymore, and to you it's just obvious that what that means is you just want to go out tonight, your man might interpret it in a different way, which the wording in his mind might be something that would make more sense to phrase it as you're a bad boyfriend and I'm unhappy with you. But you as the girl might not be thinking that at all. You just might be thinking that you actually like him a lot and you want to go out tonight, and you can't remember the last time you went out, even though it might have been 2 days ago. But right now, you're just thinking you want to go. And so you say, we never go out anymore. And he gets the other. Then if he reacts defensively, you as the girl might then say, oh, why do you have to be so defensive? But instead, what you can do is think, okay, so the conclusion is that he got what's obvious to you, which is that you want to go out tonight. But then you use that conclusion as a premise. So if he heard you say, we want to go out tonight, is it really likely that, how would he probably respond? Again, if he knew that you wanted to go out tonight, you might have felt like you said the most obvious thing in the world when you said, we never go out anymore. That might have just felt like, to you saying it might be so obvious as a girl, as a woman, that just means let's go out tonight. But if you think about it, if your man really understood what you were saying, would he act so defensively? Probably not. So there's no reason then to say, why are you being defensive? That's just obnoxious. Instead, you would want to say, oh, maybe you could realize that, again, if you're asking the question constantly, creatively in communication of, is the person getting the same meaning that I'm intending? Then when he responds in a way that doesn't really seem in accordance with the meaning that you intended, then instead of reacting back to his odd response in a downward spiral, you can just fix the communication itself. Also make sure that you're being creative with not just that they understand you, but that you understand them. Another related idea of when you want to be creative is the way their subconscious normally works and the way that people normally view the world. Again, in the core product, in the core methodology, I talk about how the way that people normally see the world is that there's objects, that they're an object walking around in the world, in the physical world that is conscious. And that's actually not the correct way to understand the world. That's not how the world works. Our subconscious minds, the way that we treat other people, our subconscious minds ends up twisting other people into being objects as well. It treats them as conscious objects, but still objects. And so people will project who a person is onto that person rather than natively trying to see more who that I was going to say more than creatively see how that person is, but it's not that great a phrase or an explanation. In particular, what people can do is project based on past experiences with other people who aren't even that person. So if you meet a person for the first time, either in business or you're dating them or whatever, they can look at you and just have this sort of composite projection that is particularly a fabrication of their own mind that's not really related to you. And you can do the same. Your subconscious is going to do the same thing to other people. And you need to be creative in order to understand. I don't want to say see, but understand a person more accurately. And the more you have the core worldview and the mental model of the law of implication in general, the better you are there. I explain that in more detail when I explain the whole model in the core training. I don't want to sidetrack things too hard to go into that now. And that's not the purpose of these module videos. And one last warning regarding that example is if you suspect that someone else is not getting the communication that you intend to, or if you suspect that you're not getting the communication that the other person intends, asking an explicit question is generally not accurate. So if you just look at someone and say, do you understand? People lie about that nonstop, right? If you say, are you getting this? Or is this just, as a matter of fact, people will actually answer more emphatically when they have no idea what you're talking about than they will if they understand what you're talking about. That's when they'll extra try to turn up the line and be like, oh yeah, I understand. Because especially if they just want you to stop talking about that topic. You do say, does that make sense? And they answer particularly emphatically. Then look closely at their body language. It's fairly likely that they have no idea what you're talking about. And the more you pay attention to this, the more you'll automatically by default have a good feel for whether someone's understanding what you intend for them to understand, or whether you're understanding what someone else intends to understand. It'll become more and more easy by default. But that whole example there, I went off on a bit of a relationship example, would explain linear extrapolation, but that example will take you so far in life in both business and in personal relationships. If you don't just constantly not realize that miscommunication is going on when you're not creating a space to get past that and to bridge the communication properly. And also projecting your own archetype version of an object on top of who they are onto somebody. Both can limit them and keep them from changing in a way that can be helpful. And it can be disrespectful. It could, in some cases, really hurt them badly. In other cases, it just causes mild sense of someone feeling like an object, or a disconnection between the two and a lack of closeness, and et cetera. So it manifests itself in different ways, but there can be fairly negative. And overcoming that is an example of how creativity works. Right? You need to open up a space with the right questions, and then get the answers to that. And you don't just get answers in life by explicitly asking someone and hearing their response, right? You have to be looking for implications and understanding the idea of implication more and more. Okay, I'll move on here to this, what I wrote here, perception versus reality. All right, this is actually going to be pretty impactful as well, very important for you. When your brain has a goal inside of it, it automatically twists let's say that the goal is to be a pretty smart person, or feel like that sort of thing, which a lot of people have, or to be a little bit better than their peers, right? If that's the goal, then, or to feel like you're an attractive person, then, or to feel like you make enough money, or that a sales letter is good, the sales copy is good. The way our brains work is that our brains pretty much completely substitute the goal. They make the goal be to perceive that the goal has been reached rather than actually reaching a goal. At which point once it's perceived, the goal gets twisted to be perception, and our brain will actually try to avoid feedback from reality that can interfere with the perception of the goal being reached. So if somebody wants to be smart, they'll start to do counterproductive things to reinforce the perception that they're already smart, rather than helping the reality behind that, which is to get their ideas, maybe to accumulate more knowledge as well. But people can often be quite defensive about sales copy. If you're trying, that manifests itself all throughout the process of trying to make money for yourself. Or if you're just you can imagine someone who works this happens all the time. It's very hard to give feedback or receive feedback, right? If you're working in an office or for a boss, or same thing, it can be on your own, in your own business. It can be hard to get accurate feedback because people want to believe that they're, simplistically speaking, good, right? They want to believe that they're competent already, that they're already smart, already competent, already did a good job. What is that? Because their goal for all that is to perceive that they're doing well, because that's how your subconscious brain twists things. Your subconscious can't really tell the difference. And this seeps into your conscious brain as well. Not your conscious, the part of your brain. Of course, when I say conscious brain, the part that's responsible more directly for what comes into your consciousness field. But in essence, I'll just say your brain can't really tell the difference between perception and reality for the most part. In a way that there's some exceptions, or that's not a perfect statement, but it's very useful to start thinking of it that way. And that in many cases, perception and reality is identical. Certainly if someone's in a relationship, then if the other person wants to make them believe that they're liked or loved, that it's going to be, this of course relates to the idea of bias, right? If we want to believe something, then bias can only work if perception fulfilled our goal, our feeling of achieving goals. If reality is the only thing that could let us achieve goals, we wouldn't be biased about anything. We would just it would just be, because it would have to be reality based. In politics, people feel happy when a politician's elected. They feel very happy. It's the reality of conditions being better in the country isn't really what makes people happy in politics. It's more the outcome of elections, which is more based on perception. Before, when I talked about communication, a person could, you've seen this happen, I'm sure, where a person will talk to someone else and feel very satisfied afterward that the other person understood what they said, regardless whether the person had any idea, right? So the speaker could feel totally satisfied, like their goal feels totally fulfilled. And it's all based on a perception of being understood rather than the reality of it. So you can see that. And as a matter of fact, if you were to walk up to the person who felt great because they thought the other person really understood them, or maybe that they thought that this other person really liked them, and if you walk up to them and say, hey, wait a second, that person didn't understand a word you said, or that person actually hates you, or at least disliked you, or didn't like you very much, they'll actually get upset at you, most likely, right? Which is interesting, because if their goal was to have the reality, if their brain, that's the fact that they would get upset at you, proves by implication, that's how we can know that their brain didn't have the goal of the reality that the person likes them, or the reality of them being understood. If that was the case, the person would thank you greatly that you pointed that out. And once in a while that will happen. Once in a while you'll point something quote unquote bad out, but you'll just be acknowledging reality to someone or to yourself, and you'll feel great about that. You'll be like, wow. And that's because the goal somehow didn't get twisted. You really want the reality, generally because you interfered consciously with the situation and really recognized things properly with reality, where you got your brain untwisted to have it focused on a goal that involves reality rather than perception. And this is how you want to be, certainly. And I think I've turned myself into a good example of this. I'm not claiming to be perfect in this, but a pretty good example where I really do want the reality of the ideas in my brain being correct, all right, and better, and not just to believe that I'm smart. Okay, I'm not concerned with how I am or how my brain already is, but instead I just want to get things perfect. The great thing about having a goal for perfection is that it doesn't really, it forces your brain out of just going for perception. So whenever you can the more you can, and this is why in the first video on creativity with creative tension and creative focus, and actually in the results formula itself, the first one in this module series, I had you focusing on an event that would happen after you achieved your goal in reality. If you do that properly, then that will keep your brain from twisting the goal into a perception-based goal that'll actually cause you to want to shut down and get upset at feedback from reality. So here's an important place that your brain's going to reliably go wrong. I could keep talking about this, but what you can do is to work on this for yourself and look for your own examples of this in your life. This is really important and powerful. It's a huge thing that is going to determine the quality of your life. And it can be an absolute block on you getting to where you want to be in life. And in terms of you, and also a block for you understanding for real what I'm trying to explain to you with the whole law of implication methodology and model. If your goal gets twisted into just perceiving that you understand it or feeling like you understand it, rather than setting your goal properly so it's, when I say your goal, the goal that's of course installed in your brain, so that it's a reality-based goal, and then you'll welcome feedback from reality instead of trying to close yourself off from feedback. One last example of this that really helped me was when I was dating and looking to get myself straight with the relationships where I figured everything out. I figured out a whole plan that turned out to be correct, both in what I wanted to look for in somebody and then in how a relationship should go. And I'll talk about that in the relationship module here. But one thing I realized that was particularly helpful was, look, I'm as attractive as I am in the sense that right now, in the sense that some percentage of girls will find me attractive and some percentage won't. And that percentage is currently fixed in reality. The only way I can change that percentage of girls that find me attractive and girls that don't is to change how actually attractive I am. I can't change that based on just feedback in the sense of the way our brain works. It changes its own perception of how attractive you are based on who told you recently or communicated or implied to you that you were attractive or not recently. But I counteracted that by realizing, look, this is fixed. It's not based on what I hear from people. It's based on, there's just a fixed number of people that would find me attractive and wouldn't based on the default situation. And then I can either work to improve that or not. And when it comes to, of course, to dating, you only need one person ultimately to really want to share your life with you. And then that can take care of you for the rest of your life and take care of that whole area. But realizing that the percentage was fixed and the only thing I could do to make my life better at that point would be to improve on the attractiveness, not to just improve or try to get myself to get just the right feedback that was telling me I was attractive. A lot of people fall in this category where they just want feedback that they're attractive, and that actually makes you less attractive. It's the same reason why I say that often PhDs and professors and stuff, they need to keep their image up. It's based on marketing and so forth. You just have to ask yourself, who was the first PhD? And then you realize that, what did that person name himself? Or at least he was named by a non-PhD. So they need to keep up perception, including for themselves. And that's related to arrogance and so forth. That'll actually over time make you stupider, right? All right. The last thing that we'll talk about here is confusing is with should, confusing how things are with how they should be. Now, it's okay to plan for things, particularly if something's outside of your control. You can plan that however something's been going, and it'll probably keep going that way unless you work to change it. Now, if you are if your sales letters or your amount of money you've been making or whatever, or your relationship has been going in a certain way, then if you're going to be operating on things to change it creatively, then stop presuming that you know what's going to be in the future. And particularly what's important is stop feeling like the way things have been up to now, this is very important, is how they should be. It's different to say that how they will, that's a separate issue in terms of what you think the future will be based on the past. But more important is how you think things should be, because someone who's been abused, let's say, then they can take on the belief that not only do they have the damage they have from that, which is valid, but then they think that they should, not always, of course, but it's common for people that have been abused to think that they should continue to feel bad and basically sabotage their life based on what happened in the past. So it's valid if someone is abused and that does lead to problems for them. I'm not being critical of that or blaming the victim. But what I'm saying is that it doesn't help anyone to believe that you should keep feeling that way, because then whenever you have a should type of belief, then what that is, it ends up being a goal, like a moral goal in your subconscious to maintain that into the future as reality. So again, your subconscious behaves as if the way things have been going is the way things should keep going in many cases, and basically look out for this. So if you are trying to make a change in something, which involves creating something, or either you're changing yourself or you're just creating a piece of value for money making, or if you want to change how things are going at work or whatever, you can name the usual suspects, right? Relationships and so forth. Then one thing that's going to form a block or actually work in the opposite direction of your efforts is if your subconscious, and you could just check on this, just see if you would affirm this statement. And if you feel like you would, that's coming from you. And you could be agreeing consciously, but stop, because I'm showing you now how it makes no sense. It's always wrong in every case. That in order to figure out, the only thing that should be the case in life is that you should feel perfectly happy, and so should everyone else. That's the only should in existence. And then there's strategies to get there. Nothing bad ever should happen. That's literally a contradiction in terms. You literally never, ever should feel bad. I'm not condemning you. You don't need to feel extra bad for feeling bad. So I'm not saying you shouldn't feel bad in the sense that you should feel shamed or guilty or extra bad for feeling bad either. That would be just another case of where you should feel bad. All right. But literally, it's a contradiction in terms. It's always wrong to believe that you should feel bad. It isn't extra wrong to feel bad. You should include, right? As I said, you shouldn't feel bad, including you shouldn't feel bad about feeling bad. If you feel bad, then you want to start asking creative questions about how the things could be better and then how to get there. Perfectly fine to acknowledge reality. Acknowledging reality only makes you feel bad if your brain is making this mistake and it's accidentally set a goal for the perception of achieving the goal rather than the reality of achieving the goal. So again, acknowledging reality seems negative only because of a mistake and only because of this mistake. If you don't make this mistake, then acknowledging reality, including if someone else acknowledges reality in terms of constructive criticism, then it won't feel bad. Now, someone might be thinking that they're acknowledging reality, but they could be incorrect. So someone could criticize you and be wrong. Keep that in mind. When I was working on developing the law of implication years ago, I didn't call it that at that time. But when I was working on developing all this, for years, I didn't make very much money. I didn't really work all that much. I had my own business teaching accelerated learning course that I created for myself. And I would teach it to students at the University of Virginia that I would advertise with flyers and they would sign up privately. But I didn't make all that much money. Without the internet, it was hard to expand. I hoped to, but when I tried to expand it, the logistics, I just didn't really make it work. And I didn't rent a place. So I just got a place on campus, a room. So I knew the University of Virginia very well because I went there, and it just ended up not working very well to expand. And I also lived there. And so I made the money I made, but I also had lots of time free. People would suggest, like my parents or friends, that I should go get a job and make more money. And it wasn't that they were right or wrong, but they were sure that they're right. It turned out that it wasn't clear at the time. They weren't necessarily wrong either. But it turned out that they weren't right and they didn't have the information. They didn't know what I was working on. And they were maybe trying to constructively criticize or point out things. And then in that case, they ended up being wrong. So people can certainly be wrong, and you don't even need an example for that probably. So you do still need to figure out whether they're right about their criticism, or if someone doesn't like your sales letter. If you write a sales letter or an affiliate page sales letter type situation that isn't a final sales letter, but it's getting people to go to a different sales letter and buy, then you don't need to please people that are not the audience for the niche or the product, and that's important. So people could be giving you feedback. If you show your friends or your family, they might not like the letter, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. Right? And there's almost no correlation between that. Please, for yourself, for your own sake, work on noticing this. You do this all the time, almost certainly. Your brain is doing this to you all the time. Right? And it's causing blocks for you in living an even better life. And also notice this, and this is a huge deal. And I remember we talked about this in communication and how generally your brain is going to linearly extrapolate things. I'm actually going to do a separate video for the money getting module. It's not going to be on creativity itself, but I'm going to try to show you how there's different types of curves. Malcolm Gladwell in his latest book, David and Goliath, talks about a U-shaped curve sometimes and how things don't always just work in a linear fashion of correlation. Of course, there's exponential curves. There's things that plateau, and I'll try to show you how to notice those and plan for those. I use the awareness of those types of when I plan, which my OMG Machines business. I also use it in other places in my life. And it's very helpful to have, it helps you to think quickly by default, to have those at your fingertips, so to speak. So I will talk about that. And I mention that because the linear extrapolation thing, that's our default of our subconscious. So the stuff I talk about in this video is particularly fruitful for you to launch off of and to work on yourself and to start noticing examples of it. And then you can go back and see how I suggested that you deal with it in those cases, all of which relates to asking better questions that open up a new space, which is a creative process. So creativity involves opening up a new space and getting it filled in the right way, including, of course, going out and getting the building blocks, right? You're not going to come up with a good creatively successful sales letter unless you do a lot of good research in most every case. All right. I hope you enjoyed the creativity series. It probably talks about a number of things you didn't really expect or they're related to creativity. Maybe at times it might have seemed too deep or whatever, but you want to get over the sense of things being too deep for law of implication stuff. Of course, we're going to constantly go all the way to the bottom of things whenever we can.